the debate about surveillance has taken a level of visibility that it had never had before. And people who know me know that I'm a fundamental optimist. At least it had a wonderful result, that those issues that were absolutely out of the picture in the past are now plainly in the open. That doesn't make them easier to solve, as we all see, but it has at least triggered a huge debate. The other thing that was very strongly revealed by those elements was the notion that if you apply territorial criteria, you can have a situation of full extraterritorial extension and applicability of the national sovereignty because of the location of operators. All the things that have been revealed were particularly visible or particularly possible because of the location of and incorporation of those companies under US jurisdiction. And so this highlighted, and this directly connects with the work we're doing, the difficulty of finding criteria to determine what are applicable laws if you use only territorial criteria, because in most cases, the users, the servers, the companies, the intermediary, the ISPs and so on may be distributed in very different countries. And this is an ongoing discussion at the moment regarding what kind of criteria. Less or more problematic maybe was the spontaneous reaction of data localization. In order to avoid surveillance, we need to have the data about my citizens located in my country. It's a national cloud and so on. Without getting into too much detail for the sake of time, if you think a little bit about it, it has two problems. First, technically, it's a little bit hard to implement, and we can get into more detail because it makes a very funny tangle of issues. But the second thing is what I call in another comment, something that is not scalable, because if you multiply it in every country in this way, you get to absurd situations where you think that, okay, the data about Maltese citizens should be in Malta on a Maltese cloud. And if you multiply this by all the numbers, I don't want to even apply that to the small Pacific islands, makes no sense. So this is a type of approach that was probably a spontaneous reaction. To be frank, a lot of people have noted, as was mentioned in the Bali IGF last year, that it would certainly not reduce the amount of surveillance, but probably enhance it, because it would duplicate the data in more countries. And the interesting case to be studied, and we can talk more about it later, is the evolution in the discourse, for instance, in Brazil, in the Marco Civil, where you know that there were provisions for data localization that have been shifted to provisions for access to data about Brazilian citizens, irrespective of the location. Not that it is a perfect solution, but it is interesting to see how the debate is shifting. And there is this big case in the US at the moment with Microsoft regarding access to data that is stored in Europe. This issue of the criteria for access to data, I mean the lawful and legal access to data, is going to be a huge debate in the coming years.
Thanks very much for your comments, Bertrand. You've touched upon government reactions, particularly in Brazil with regards to legislation that has been passed recently. I'm also curious about touching upon industry reaction. How have providers in the private sector responded in the last several months? I was wondering, Sarah, whether you could provide some comment with regards to that from your perspective at Facebook.
Sure. So following the events that Kevin helpfully outlined, I think there was a recognition across industry that the balance in many countries had tipped too far in favor of the state and away from individual rights to protect their information. So a group of companies it's one of the first instances I can think of where tech companies have come together and called collectively for reform, global reform. And the way that we structured this was to set out a group of principles. So it wasn't intended to be prescriptive because we wanted it to have global application, but it was meant to go through and highlight the areas where we felt there was a real need to address issues, because the bottom line is that people won't use technology that they don't trust. And so, I mean, I'm just briefly to walk you through those. The first principle was to limit government authority to collect user information. And basically, this is just about sensible limitations. It's just about making sure that there are processes and limits. It's not a blank check. Governments don't have a blank check for information. That puts industry in a very difficult position where governments try to do that. The next principle was the need for improved oversight and accountability. And what we're talking about there is having processes in each country to create checks and balances. And I think the Snowden revelations really shone a light on an area where there wasn't a lot of information out in the public arena, that no one was clear what checks and balances were in place, and there's a real need to institute these. The third principle was around transparency for government requests. So many companies publish transparency reports, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, and others, and explicitly state what requests we've had from government, what information we provide, break it out into detail. And this is something that we would encourage governments to do. There should be transparency around what information governments are requesting. And then the fourth principle was around the free flow of information. And this, Bertrand touched on forced data localization in his comments. There's a real concern that the knee-jerk reaction to these revelations was going to be a series of countries requiring infrastructure to be built within their national boundaries in order for them to assert control. And there was a real sense there that responding with trying to ground the cloud would have very significant consequences and actually wouldn't address the issues that had been brought to light by these revelations. And then the fifth principle was around avoiding conflicts between governments. And essentially that's talking about reforming the MLAT process, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty process, and the need to have a functional system whereby governments can get information. I think the sense is that this is an area where reform, improvement is long overdue. It's natural that conflicts arise between governments, but there needs to be a way to resolve those and a framework to resolve those that is understood, that is clear, that is fast, that is transparent, and that's not the process we're in. So essentially, I don't want to take a minute, but essentially those were the principles laid out by the companies. We're continuing to advocate and build on these 5 principles, and we're also continuing to listen, and part of the reason we're here is to get more ideas about what more we can be doing in light of these revelations to truly bring reform in this area.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Sarah, for your comments. I'm also curious about other government reactions we might see in other parts of the world. Izumi, can you talk a little bit about what the reaction has been in Asia-Pacific, particularly in Japan?
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. And sorry for the guys who don't have the chairs. I feel a bit guilty. But there was a very, very, very little reaction in Japan and some parts of the Eastern Asia to the revelation. I checked with Wikipedia, and there are certain sections devoted to each country's reactions. In Japan, just one quote. That's Mr. Suga, the cabinet secretary, and said, "Oh, it's a U.S. domestic issue, and it should be handled within the U.S." Yeah, for the Japan-U.S. diplomacy or diplomatic relations, our secrets should be kept well. For the bilateral collaboration, including sharing information, full stop. I couldn't find any visible, strong reactions from any human rights activists or consumer organizations of sort. In general, they are not too strong, unfortunately, but also specifically for this case. I haven't really done a good interview with the public audience, people in the street, but maybe the general take is, oh, our privacy was not directly invaded that badly. I don't have much secret to the US government. So why do you care? Or, well, what we can do anyway. From the Cold War days, we were all aware, or many of us aware, that US has been doing all the intelligence activities of wiretapping anything. There were at least 2 or 3 facilities in Japan with huge, how do you say, antennas, intercepting any communication from Russia or China or wherever, and they're decoding all. So to some degree, from the 50s at least. For me, for example, it wouldn't be a surprise if the US agencies are not tapping the internet. I'm not saying that they should do that, but that's kind of the old guy's cliche. Also in Japan, there's something called secrecy of communication. It's literally translated like that at our constitution, which was established after the war, or the Second World War. That is a reflection of why Japan started or engaged in such a bad war. And one take is that before the war, under the regime, there was no guarantee of privacy or anything, that all this censorship or would make people fear that you have no free speech and stuff. So that, under the guidance of the United States government and army, I think, who were occupying Japan, that some guys, both Japanese and Americans, came up with the idea that in order not to repeat the same mistakes, let's just keep the highest standard. So our Minister of Communication is usually very much demanding the ISPs and others to respect all the secrecy, meaning the substance of the communication, as a sort of holy thing. However, it's getting sort of more compromised these days. They started wiretapping law with a lot of controversy and stuff, and they're tightening up that. But the general direction is that at least within Japan, we don't have that much sense of fear. I just spoke briefly with a Korean friend from their NGOs and asked about Korean reactions. There were very little as well. And we agreed that we are not the big 5 countries allied to the US, unlike in Canada or New Zealand, but very similar, at least Korea and Japan are, under the sort of international politics. We need the US power is a sort of general norm, so it's very difficult to go against that, and they keep quiet, and Korea the same way. But also at the same time, Koreans have more problem with their own national intelligence agencies using the SNS, smart media or Twitter and Facebook to influence the presidential campaign in favor of their party candidates. So that's the public rage and anger war targeted at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Zumi. Let me ask you, okay, so what's the situation in the developing economies? What has been the reaction with these other countries that we may not be hearing about?
Thank you, Mark. So I can speak a bit about, let me start by saying something about MLATs. I think it may be helpful for those who may not know what an MLAT is, a mutual legal assistance treaty between nations where they can exchange data based on if there's been an event or crime and they're investigating, prosecuting. And what I think is very good to see is a move, at least in the US, of trying to modernize its MLAT. And I'll tell you why that matters to developing countries, because one of the greatest grouses you'll find from developing countries is we may have a bilateral mutual legal assistance treaty, but we can't get the data because the US State Department will never give it to us, or we don't get responses. And so the MLAT process is broken, or it's too slow, et cetera, et cetera. So let's localize data. Let's force Google, Yahoo, and Facebook to localize data, because that's the only solution we have. And from a developing country perspective, I think it helps knowing that at least in the US, and I hope the other Five Eyes also sort of adopt this, is try to modernize and improve their MLAT process. I just want to say that there's an aspect there that may impact developing countries. What reaction? There's a lot of different countries that have had different reactions, but generally speaking, it is disappointing to note, just like Azumi said, that there hasn't been a substantial response which would have been useful or positive, in the sense that there would be a reaction to surveillance, a looking deeper inside and saying, what are we doing as a country that we need to stop? Should we ask questions of our own intelligence agencies or others? And funnily enough, what I found in most places was it was the politicians in certain developing countries who got more concerned about things like this than did the intelligence services, strangely enough. And you would have thought that the politicians would be concerned about the intelligence collection, but apparently they control most of it. In a sense, the reports come to them. And so they wanted to say, well, if they're sort of wiretapping each other, how come I'm not getting reports from my intelligence? Or what else can I do? It was a very odd reaction. I would have thought that it was the intelligence agency who would want to be pushing first. So this five-eye envy, in a sense, was remarkable. So it worsened the surveillance coming from certain. I mean, you would have expected the intelligence guys to do a pitch for this, but it was really strange. And the characterization of the U.S. was they screwed up, which means they're silly to have a law, they're silly to have a court. Look at us, thank God we don't have those problems. We don't have to go to a court. We don't have to get a warrant. What do you mean a warrant? This is not a criminal justice. This is intelligence, for God's sake. So thank God we don't have a law, and then that's continuing. So there are many countries out there, if you ask them, do you have an intelligence legislation? The answer is, no, we don't want one. Because what we're doing is legal as it is, and we don't want a law around it. We don't want to deal with that kind of aspect. No one's calling them out on it. Nobody locally is calling them out on it. No human rights, civil society organizations. The reaction a lot of times in these is, well, it's a bad country. We expect this of them. What are you going to do? And that's disappointing, because what's happening is there was an opportunity maybe to push the envelope. And so fine, it happened in the States, it happened in Europe, it happened in many other countries. We're not seeing that happening in certain countries, but I'd like to see that happen, for instance. Not really happening. So there were two options. One is, let's respond to this by promulgating legislation which is repressive. Let's do this. Let's try and take criminal justice warrants and intelligence warrants and put that in one law. And have everything under one judge. It should be a secret process. No one's going to know what's happening. They're supposed to have a right to be able to respond or appeal, but the natural question is, if they don't know what's happening, how will someone appeal? Those are the kind of legislations on the one side. So you're seeing this repressive legislation, or you're seeing policies being implemented where it's saying, let's take everything that comes into X country. And this is sometimes government-owned corporates in some developing countries going cross-border, getting licenses, I'm not going to take names, and saying, let's talk to the other country and say, I think it's in our mutual interest. So there's international coordination and cooperation on this, which is remarkable. Let's see if we can get all your data that's flowing through your country and see if we can centralize it and hand it over to one provider. Because it's great, because you are now not going to have operational costs. You can fire a whole bunch of folks. Your profits go up because of that. And if it's telecom termination of calls coming from outside, because that's part of the whole data centralization, guess what? We can jack up rates by 800%. The country makes foreign exchange through that. It's very attractive, and some countries have implemented this. And even business sometimes has said, oh yeah, let's sign off. Some of them were even businesses in Europe who had licenses in those countries. Again, I'm not taking names. If anyone wants to know, I'll take it offline. That's the kind of stuff that, so either it's, let's have a law, or let's set up these systems through policy. Actually, I mean, it's written, it's there, this is what we're going to do. Or not have a law and let's continue doing what we're doing, or maybe enhance it. And then you have international cooperation through certain vendors. I won't take the name, but there's a certain handset who's not doing really well these days. They went into a country and said, here's a box. Anything that flows through this box, you can decrypt. Welcome. Let us sell our devices. That's happening. So we're not seeing something positive come out of this, unfortunately, those areas. So I'm a little disappointed, because what I'd like to see is locally within those countries some discussion on this, just like you're seeing the discussion in the States and in Europe. Have that, and also the international calling out of these kind of activities, either at the ITU or other places. Why is this activity not being called out? It's just no one cares, which I think is not helpful. I want to sort of end with the, I know we're going to continue the discussion, and another interesting thing happened. I come from Pakistan, so I want to share with you an anecdote. Everybody knows that YouTube in Pakistan is blocked. And the measures that were adopted were part of the blocking, and it's part of the national security legislation and a whole bunch of different things. Sort of, it fits into being able to control through these measures that I just talked about earlier. And you may have seen the television, seen the protests and riots outside the Prime Minister's house and the Supreme Court. What happened was that the government had a particular channel that used to basically project its own views. It didn't own it, but they had very good coordination with this particular channel. So because of the division within the country between the government and others, that particular channel was taken off the air on cable operators. So suddenly the government, which had blocked YouTube, found that one of its cable channels wasn't able to broadcast within the country at a time like this, when they really needed to get the government side of the story out. And they couldn't. Now, it was there in some parts of the country, but not in others. So guess what you had to do? You had to build a VPN through YouTube and try to get the government's message, because you wanted both sides of the story. And the government was like, oh my God. I mean, I don't think it realized it yet, but a lot of people were accessing because, basically bypassing the government's policies to get to this information, which would have been helpful to the government. Anyway, I wanted to leave you with that anecdote. So strange things are happening there. Thank you.
There's one other question I wanted to ask with regards to the EU-specific reaction. I know that for a number of years there has been the EU Data Retention Directive. And I was wondering if someone on the panel would like to volunteer to discuss what that is and how these revelations have affected the debate regarding the EU Data Retention Directive. Bertrand, would you perhaps be interested in talking about that?
Well, as a matter of fact, I think the debate has evolved in many respects regarding privacy in Europe. The first thing, when we talk about data retention, we need to understand that the situation has changed significantly in terms of the types of service that have private data. When we were talking about data retention, and particularly the framework that you're mentioning, it used to be about mobile operators mainly. We were dealing with voice, and so basically you had very limited amount of information.
Can you explain what the data retention directive is?
Well, so fundamentally data retention is any kind of requirement from operators to keep the data about the communications, and particularly metadata, who this person has called at what time during which duration, beyond the period that the operator itself has any commercial interest in keeping it. And that's where the whole debate comes from, because the operator, when it's just for voice, the faster they can get rid of the data, the better. So for police and criminal investigations purposes, etc., the requirement to keep more data was a big battle about which duration, what amount of data, what conditions for access, etc. What I wanted to highlight is that the debate is shifting now regarding the privacy and the data protection regime in Europe, because the platforms that we use, and that goes actually for the mobile operators themselves, who are more and more the gateway to the internet and have much more data that they can collect, including geolocation, which is an extremely important piece of data. The content that we put on the platforms is content that we want them to keep for a long time. I was joking the other day that in the future, people will have their Facebook timeline running on LCD screen on their tombstones. And so they will have their whole life. I mean, that is the business to start in there. But we want our data to be there. I'm using Gmail. I want my data and my mails from 5 years, 10 years to be in there. Complete different situation from what it was when the mobile phone operators were discarding the data much faster. So this is what has changed the landscape in terms of surveillance, because I used often the expression the treasure trove. People in the law enforcement or in the surveillance are seeing this huge amount of data that indeed may be useful for criminal investigations, but the framework for accessing it is being completely inappropriate today. So I think the debate about data retention, I must confess that I have not followed in precise detail the most recent evolution, but what is clear is that the debate on the evolution of the regime for data protection in Europe is strongly reactivated at the moment by the Snowden revelations. And I would say that in a certain way it's a good thing, especially if it highlights the difficulty to use purely geographical criteria to determine the conditions of access to data and the rules of protection. So it is opening up the debate in a way, and I think in one of the outcomes as well of the Snowden revelation is that the debate has to be broader than it was. The discussion about the data protection regulation in Europe has been too limited to a small group of actors for a certain period, and it's now being opened more broadly.
And actually, that leads to the question about positive developments or things that have helped the industry and civil society and governments move forward as a result of this. I was wondering, Sarah, you spoke a little bit about the 8 principles. Do you think that we've had positive, something positive come out of this entire episode?
I think the fact that we're having this session and that these issues are out in the open to be discussed is positive. I think there's still a really long way to go before there's meaningful reform. I think it's interesting how quickly a lot of these issues on the solution side are no longer being discussed. So there's an acceptance of the issue. There's not as active in a debate around, like, how do we get a functional MLAT framework? How do we make sure that this process of access to data is done in a transparent way? I think I probably would have anticipated more discussion about that continuing. So I think it's positive that we've articulated principles for reform. I think it's positive that you're getting people coming from civil society, from industry, some from government, really grappling with these issues. But in terms of concrete things we can point to as having addressed the situation since the revelations, I think there's still a long way to go.
In addition to the policy debate that's been prompted by this, which, frankly, many of us in civil society in the US have been trying to have this debate for many, many years, and the Snowden documents finally made it impossible to ignore and has prompted a large legislative fight in the US. There are 2 particular good outcomes here that I wanted to point to. One is the utter explosion of transparency reporting as a best practice in the ICT field, at least in the US, but starting to spread internationally. You now have internet there were a handful of companies reporting before Snowden. Now you have dozens of companies, large and small, in and out of the US, internet and telco, that are doing transparency reporting and pushing for permission from the government to publish more about national security requests. So, and in the US, you also now have the government itself reporting more in terms of numbers about how much surveillance it does, how many people are affected. We have some problems with the way they're reporting those numbers, but it's still more data than they've ever published before. The other really positive outcome that I see is the concern about NSA surveillance has finally put the focus on crypto, on encryption, as an important part of the internet infrastructure. It has prompted internet companies, also large and small, to begin deploying encryption in a way they haven't before. Encryption between their website and the user, encryption between mail servers, encryption between their data centers, particularly in response to the NSA hacking Yahoo and Google. So I think that this kind of focus on hardening the internet ecosystem as a result of the NSA scandal protects all of us from all attackers, whether it's the NSA or other intelligence communities or criminals or whatever, and is a wonderful, wonderful result. And it's about time, but better late than never.
Thanks, Kevin.
Actually, one quick, worth noting on that front, the IETF itself has at this point declared that pervasive monitoring is a technical attack that should be mitigated in the design of IETF protocols. So we're even seeing this taken up as a top concern by the technical community and not just the companies. Thanks.
So what do you think from the developing economy perspective?
I just want to say something about retention a little bit and then go into that. It's interesting, you know, in many developing countries, there's no distinction between metadata and content data. And it's just data. When we survey and we collect data, data is data, you know. And in fact, frankly, call logs and other ISP traffic data is considered easy to get it. Well, what's the problem? It's just a log. It's, you know, somebody used an IP address. Why is that a problem? Because they don't necessarily have data protection concepts or rules in their country, so that distinction really doesn't exist. So retention has become sort of a default. But for those countries where this will be a problem, and it is with the judgment that's come out from the ECJ, I think I won't go into details of where there may be some interpretation of that. You know, in principle, maybe it's been accepted, but they said that the proportionality of it or necessity was an issue. The rejection of the data retention directive. Sorry, to be clear. But regardless, it has had a huge impact on many countries where retention is now out, especially in Europe and some other countries. The problem that arises is that still there's going to be surveillance in some form. So if you can't retain data, well, how do you do it? So maybe the fix is that you do more interception. And that may mean that there will be more interception requests, targeted ones, in such volume that technically they're not retention, but you're getting there. So there's that discussion. And so I think one of the good things is, at least there's now a debate because of this debate in the US and the EU, that maybe this debate could be moved forward to developing countries saying, don't you think you guys should have a distinction between how your country and your legislation deals between metadata and traffic data and things like that. It's also a very positive thing that we, as I mentioned earlier, the MLAT reform that's taking place in some countries. I know that the US is doing this, I don't know, and we hope to hear more tomorrow and day after from some of the panels on what that reform will mean. But I hope other countries other than the US are also thinking about doing that, because otherwise there will be such a push from some developing countries who want to get stuff, and if they can't get it, they will just work it around. The other thing which I think is useful is that the best practice that is developing, I mean, there's a lot of criticism about how the US does things, how Europe does certain things, but at least there's a concept of saying, oh, there's a court, there's judicial supervision. It's not perfect, but it could be improved. But at least there's that structure. And giving those ideas to the rest of the world, I think, is very valuable. Because anytime anybody, any legislator now sits there and thinks about their own legislation, they should be able to say, well, why don't we do it like they do it? Why are we just giving them an authorization which is like a carte blanche? What are the, so sharing those best practices, I think, and the transparency of what the US and how it's doing it will maybe push that envelope in many countries who may now be thinking about, or hopefully there may be some push to have them bring in some reform. But there's been, I think, this is my view, and again, I think you will find that there will be greater trust in the US to some extent from developing countries, and I'll explain why. If you're in a repressive country, or even in a moderately repressive country, and if I have data, and I know my government's accessing that data, and is doing it in a certain form, what am I going to do? The first thing I'm going to do is try to VPN everything through my Dropbox, and I want to encrypt it. And guess where I'm going to house it? I'm not going to house it in my servers in my country, or any country like mine. I'm going to look at the West, or countries where there's better protection. So maybe now that I know the US has better safeguards, or is going to have better safeguards, maybe that's a location. Maybe Canada's a location. Maybe other countries where I feel that things are going to be safer would be a location. So maybe that's a positive. Maybe that's what marketing strategies need to look at. So hopefully, you know, that will come. But I've noticed that we haven't seen people delete their at least in my part of the world, delete their Facebook accounts or their Gmail accounts. In fact, most of the time if you ask them, I said, when I'm doing training for law enforcement, are you in the cloud? Do you use cloud services? No one raises their hands and say, well, do you use Yahoo? Yes, you know, by hand. Yes, I do use Yahoo. Hotmail? Yes, I do. Microsoft 365? Yes, I do. Do you use apps on an iPad? Yes, I do. And suddenly you realize that, you know, that's cloud. That's not data that you've got on your device or data that's in a server in your own country. So I think, you know, I haven't really seen a huge fallout of people walking away. So that's a good thing. But with the improvements, hopefully, that we've seen, that I talked about earlier, I think I hope that will lead to betterment. Thanks.
Thanks. Bertrand, what do you think with regards to how the rules are changing moving forward, and whether we've seen responsive legislation that might be a positive outcome?
Well, I was, one of the elements almost provocatively is, for those of you who have followed the different international processes, and particularly the Net Mondial conference, we need to remember that indirectly, the Net Mondial conference was triggered by the Snowden revelations. It raised the bar of visibility, and the end result was actually a set of principles. They might not be perfect, but we've been talking about principles for ages in the IGF. A lot of work has been preparing this, and it has been catalyzed because of this. So in a certain way, the existence of principles, the incredibly increased debate about privacy at the global level, and about surveillance, which was a completely hidden debate for most years in the past. It was something that were not debated. This has been a form of progress. That being said, we're confronted with an environment where, even if the desire to find new frameworks, the desire to have multi-stakeholder interaction and so on is clearly growing, and that's a good thing, Sarah was mentioning, and Zahid were mentioning, the notion of MLATs. Improving the MLAT system, its efficiency and its scope is great, but the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty principle is that it is mostly bilateral between countries. There are some multilateral, but usually it's bilateral. They vary tremendously from country to country. I mean, the US has a lot of mutual legal assistance treaties, but they don't contain the same kind of clauses with one country and the other. They do not exist among all countries. They're on mostly criminal issues and cooperation, and they have one component that is absolutely essential, which is dual incrimination in most cases. So you need to have something that is criminal on one side and on the other side, which means that in most of the cases when there is a problem of tension between one country and an operator or a platform that is located in the US, the law in the country does not conform with the law in the US, particularly on issues of speech and expression. And therefore, the MLATs are completely out of the picture. They are not a tool that can be used for most of the tensions on legal issues when it is not a dual incrimination. Of course, the Cybercrime Convention has tried to harmonize a little bit on substance. It is not universal, it's growing, a lot of people are copying, it's putting in the legislations in a certain number of countries. But we need to agree and understand that harmonization on substance is not going to be achieved in the foreseeable future, particularly on issues that are related to freedom of expression. And so the big challenge that we're confronted with, and we have to find innovative ways to do it as we try, is if we cannot do harmonization on substance, harmonization on what is legal expression, what is legal activities, and so on, we need at least to develop frameworks for harmonization on procedures so that the highest level of due process can be put in place. And so when we talk about surveillance, I was mentioning in the beginning that the main challenge for me is the question of oversight and whether the parliamentary oversight is appropriate. It's a question of process. The second element was that it shows the impact of extraterritoriality and extraterritorial extension of sovereignty. This question of extraterritorial extension of sovereignty is now emerging very strongly in the environment of the internet, because we are in an environment of legal competition between the different countries who are all trying to re-territorialize. Somebody used a wonderful expression. They're trying to legislate themselves out of the problem. Like, they don't know how to apply their national law or how to enforce their national laws. So they say, I'm making a new law to enforce my national law and actually apply it to as many people outside of my country as I can. Hence making the problem even harder to solve, because you get into a new harmonization thing. So I think both on the surveillance debate, and I would agree with what Zaid said somehow it's becoming ironic that the bad practice revealed are becoming a sort of benchmark for better practices in other countries. So that's the kind of back and forth situations in the environment. But I think both on the surveillance and on the interactions between countries, particularly on law enforcement with platforms and so on other issues, the notion of due process is an essential element. Like, how are the users involved and aware of what is happening? How do they have the capacity to express themselves in the contradictory procedure? How can they get redress? That sort of thing. Focusing on developing transboundary or transnational due process mechanisms is a very large issue that spans a lot of topics. We're trying to do it on issues related to domain seizures and content takedown, but there are many other issues. And I just wanted to insert this expression due process because it's a thread that we could probably use in many in-media discussions.
Just very quickly, I want to say also this raises the issue of sovereignty. So the convention basically deals with those things, you're absolutely right, where there's due criminality. But at least what it does is solve that problem. When you talk to developing countries, they say, we don't get anything. And that's why we're going to do this. So at least if you can solve a part of the problem, you're moving towards some sort of a discussion, and that's one thing. To the extent that there is lack of dual criminality between two countries, well, guess what? That's actually a good thing for both parties, and this would be the argument I'd use. If you're going to start breaching the sovereignty of each other by saying that my law should override yours, the others can do that too. No. And so, that's not a criticism, I'm just saying, so that would be the argument one would use and say, to that extent, it's a good thing that there isn't, because I don't think you're going to get harmonization, I completely agree with you. So to that extent, you need something that basically, where you need to just accept the fact that different countries are going to be different, the way they run these processes, and I don't know if you can come up with a complete solution for every problem. So at least what you can try to fix, we should try to do that, and what you cannot, try to work at it. So your project, I think, is great in that respect. Thank you. Just wanted to add that.
A two-finger. I fully agree. The only thing I wanted to highlight is that most of the international architecture is based on a fundamental principle, which is the separation of sovereignties. We tend to forget this, but the legal system is based on the separation of sovereignties, the Westphalian architecture. What we're dealing with is shared transborder spaces. And this legal competition is bringing conflicts of laws, and the way we exercise, or governments exercise sovereignty in shared spaces is not the clear-cut, my sovereignty, my law, your law. There's not a usual very thin line that says my border, your border. It is how to combine the different legitimacies and how to ensure the coexistence of very different norms in shared online spaces. That's maybe a compliment.
Well, this has been great discussion. We only have 4 minutes left for questions. But I think we should at least try to take some questions. So to be fair to the remote participants, I think I'm going to take a remote question first, and then we're going to take a question from the room. Khaled Kuba, who's our remote moderator, could you please ask a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. We have a question from a remote participant, Yulia Morinet from ATC, Together Against Cybercrime. So her question is that she would like to have our opinion, or the panelist opinion, about the role of the multilateral organization in the field of data protection regulation, and also how to support national governments in the process of protection of personal data of citizens. Thank you.
Just, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this. There are people from multilateral organizations in the room that may have something to say. It's just a prompt if they want to take the floor.
Does anyone want to answer that question? Who's on the floor?
It's right here. Right here. She's ready to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia, for the question. Yes, Sophie Kwasny from the Council of Europe. So at European level, We have the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to privacy. Our court is currently examining a pending case that deals precisely with the question, Big Brother Watch, so we're expecting that. And in terms of standard setting, there's also a lot that we're doing. We have a declaration on digital tracking that was adopted. We have our Data Protection Convention, and we have our Parliamentary Assembly working on that. So trying to couple all those actions together. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, Azumi, that there was also something happening in Japan with the relation to multilateral organizations.
I'm sorry, it's about multi-stakeholder as an indirect consequence of the Snowden revelation. As Bertrand said about NetMundial, I don't want to go to details, but in Japan there are certain movements or attempts to put the multi-stakeholder to both the personal data protection with a new independent commission, but they are clearly stating multi-stakeholder as a draft report of the policy of the government, as well as for the domain name or the CCTLD. Again, the multi-stakeholder process are really proposed to change the status quo and have more transparency as a national process to sort of synchronize or harmonize with the global convention. And I heard just also similar attempts are now being underway in Korea. So there are some unintended perhaps consequences of the Snowden revelation to share.
Thank you, Zumi. All right, we've got 1 minute left. All right, we have a question in the back with a striped shirt, gentlemen. Do we have a maybe the nearest microphone? Khaled, if you could, there you go.
Hi, so I work as a journalist revealing state secrets, and you guys are the most depressing group of people I've ever heard talk about this topic. It's seriously cynical and fatalistic, so I want to try to give you some hope. Give me a wish list of what you want to see exposed, and then I'll make it happen as much as is possible. And we will fuck them up.
Beep. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to go first.
Of all the questions.
Good. No, that was me. That was Zahid saying beep, not Mark. Okay. So from the developing world, we need your support within civil society, other governments, etc., to make this a top-line agenda within your bilateral discussions with our countries. We need you to take action within multilateral organizations like the ITU, where parties who come to that are the ones who are doing this in those countries, and nobody's even making a peep about it, not a beep, but a peep about it at all. So that's the second arena something can be done. And the third is, I know you want to bash the US government and the UK government and others, but at some point you need to start also turning your guns to the rest. Because if you don't do that, you reward the bad actors and you penalize the better actors. Not the good actors, but the better actors. So please see things in context and in perspective. It doesn't help us otherwise. Those are the three main things. If you can make that happen, I'll be a very happy man next year.
All right, everybody. You have a comment, Kevin?
I had a specific, first off, hi Jake. I wanted to say, I think what I said was fairly hopeful, and I'm actually more hopeful on this issue than I've ever been because of the information leading to so much action. My one wish is that more journalists had access to the cache of Snowden documents so we could have more reporting faster.
I will ask you back, which jurisdiction are you in? What's your cultural background?
The internet.
Doesn't answer to my question.
Sure it does. That's where I'm from.
Pardon? Where are you from? Which passport do you have?
I've got a few.
But I'd like to just recall that there are all the different cultural and societal backgrounds and the ideas, norms and stuff. What is depressing to you may not be depressing to me. And we need to recognize all the diversity being IGF. So I don't like that, you know, imposing one cultural value to others may not be that helpful. Thank you.
All right, well, with that said, I think this is a fantastic forum, and I'm glad we're able to have this discussion. the spicier the better, frankly. We are 3 minutes over time. All right, Bertrand, you can have the last word, but then we got to go.
No, it's not the last word. I just wanted to say one thing. Zahid, in many cases, insisted on the fact that most of the activities that we've been talking about regarding surveillance in many countries do not have any framework at all, because the less framework there is, the easier it is to go around. I think this should be transposed in many other aspects. There is a fundamental principle in human rights is that any limitation to the exercise of human rights should be based on law, or at least some kind of clear framework. And I think, and it would tremendously help the work I'm doing, so please go on, any pressure that says things that relate to freedom of expression, privacy, and things like that regarding the internet should have, at minimum, at the national level, a legal basis, something that clearly describes what are the criteria at the national level for decision making, would be a tremendous step. And that's just my suggestion.
Before I forget, I'm sorry, I have just 1 second here. And link overseas development assistance to this. And IP, you know, there's a section 108, is it, process in the US, for instance. Every country around the world gets scared at the section 108 process on IP. Start something like that. It'll work.
All right, everybody, we're going to have to adjourn. We're 4 minutes over. Thank you very much for attending and for a great session.